Hello and welcome back. I hope you had a good weekend. Let's go ahead and read our chapters 13, 14, and 15 for this week. And they're pretty short, so here we go. We're on page 127, chapter 13, X the Experts. The next morning, they had another surprise. This one came from Miss Hussey. She asked her students to think about what they might have done if the thief had written them a personal letter before the theft took place, a letter delivered to their home. You mean like one of the 3 letters the thief talked about? Asked Calder. Not necessarily. We're just inventing a situation. Miss Hussey answered with some of her old, we're in this together and it might be dangerous tone. Hearing the undercurrent of excitement, her class grew quiet. Miss Hussey went on to explain that this letter would have asked anonymously for their help. Say the thief had offered lots of money, promised that the cause was honorable, and, last but not least, threatened their life if they showed the letter to anyone else. Petra scribbled Calder a quick note. The letter that blew away from me at that day on Harper Avenue. It sounded just like this, except I didn't get to finish it, and I don't remember the threat. Calder read Petra's note. Miss Hussey was saying, this is a question of judgment. It's not clear in your letter if the thief is good or bad. I'm interested in what you might do. And Calder, could I keep that, please? You know I don't allow those kind of communications during class. Calder flashed an uh-oh look at Petra, who had slumped down in her seat. He stepped carefully over Denise's outstretched foot as he handed Miss Hussey the note. She popped it in her pocket. Although she knew Miss Hussey wouldn't be angry, Petra had a queasy feeling. How could the letter Miss Hussey was asking them to imagine sound so similar to the one about art and crime? But maybe this was just another coincidence, pure and simple. There had been so many lately, or maybe Miss Hussey had found the letter blowing around too. Of course, the thought was a relief. Petra sat up. Miss Hussey wrote some of their responses on the blackboard. Go directly to police and get protection. Hide the letter and try to figure out who the writer was. Change the locks on the doors. Do what was asked and have an adventure and hope you weren't breaking the law. Tell a friend and make them promise not to tell, and then talk about what to do. Miss Hussey listened closely to what the kids were saying, as she always did. At the last suggestion, her eyes suddenly filled with tears. Then, just as quickly, they were gone, and she was muttering something about dirt in her eye. Out in the hallway, Calder looked upset. He said to Petra, do you suppose Miss Hussey got one of the 3 letters and dropped it or something and you picked it up? What if she's kind of looking for help by asking us what we think? But why would the thief ask her for help? I mean, she's just a 6th grade teacher. Petra's voice sounded unsure. Good people sometimes get caught in bad things. Calder was thinking now about Tommy, about Frog, about Petra's dad, about Vermeer himself. Should Miss Hussey be added to the list? As if he or she were playing on Petra and Calder's fears, the thief resurfaced the next morning. A full-page ad appeared in the newspapers around the world. After the thief's first published letter, the fuss over a lady writing had been tremendous. The catchy phrase, you will come to agree with me, the message found inside the packing box after the painting was stolen, had been picked up everywhere. It appeared spray-painted on subway cars, on walls, and on the sides of buildings in New York City and Chicago and Tokyo and Amsterdam. It turned up on cheap T-shirts in English, Dutch, French, Spanish, even Japanese. Demonstrations were organized outside several museums, and protesters were photographed marching and shouting. There was footage on the evening news of signs that said things like, tell the truth, get her back, or X the experts, or Viva Vermeer! That means live Vermeer. Or Solamente la verdad. Museum officials had days when they had to scurry protected by police through noisy crowds to get to work. All right, so we have an illustration on page 131, and I left my card. Hold on, I'm going to go get it. Pause. Okay, I have my card. So I'm looking at page 131 with the illustration, and I'm trying to see if there's any frogs or pentominoes, because there should be one on this page, right? Because it's the every other rule or whatever. So page 131. 131. Oh, and right away, oh, I see many frogs. Holy cow. I see 3 frogs. 2 are together. 2 are real frogs. And then 1 is on a poster. Do you see all 3 frogs? There might be more than 3. But I see 3. I'm going to write down 3 frogs. See if you can find them, though. If you need a hint, 1's on a poster and 2 are by lions. And then we have to find some pentominoes. I thought maybe it was the X's, but that's not a pentomino. Oh, I see it. I see a pentomino. I think it's an F. It's between the X's there. I'm going to write that down. If you find more, let me know. F pentomino. All right, keep reading. You can pause it, this, if you want to keep looking at the illustration. It's pretty cool. I liked looking at it a lot. It was after this first wave of passion began to die down that the first full-page ad appeared. It said simply, "You are doing the right thing." Sure enough, the response from the public was instantaneous. There was more mail. There was more publicity. The next time the public seemed to be losing interest, another message appeared saying, "Be patient. Do not give up." This was also followed by a flood of letters. The ad that Calder and Petra read before school that morning in the Chicago Tribune said, "You have come to agree with me. They will come to agree with you." In tiny print below the letter, newspaper editors, under pressure from the FBI, the police, and a committee of museum directors, explained that they would not publish any more of the mysterious advertisements. This was the last. The first advertisement was mailed from New York a week after the theft, the second from Florence a week after that, and the third from Amsterdam. The thief almost seemed to be showing off, thumbing his nose at the authorities. Miss Hussey said nothing to Petra that morning about the note she had pocketed the day before. Maybe she hadn't even read it, Petra thought with relief. Class began with a discussion about the thief's latest ad. Miss Hussey asked, "Why do people assume the thief is just one person? I mean, couldn't this be a group?" She was absent-mindedly twisting her ponytail around one thumb. Calder raised his hand. "Don't the police think 3 other people are helping?" "I don't know," Miss Hussey said. "Do they? I guess it depends on what is considered helping, and whether those 3 letters even exist." She looked so genuinely concerned that Petra and Calder began to wonder if they had jumped to silly conclusions the day before. The thing was clear to 6th graders. In spite of their discussions earlier in the year with Miss Hussey, the letter as a form of communication was very much alive. Chapter 14, Flashing Lights. Calder arrived at Powell's that afternoon just as Mr. Watch was folding the top closed on a large paper bag. He nodded to Calder and began lettering S-H-A-R with an indelible marker on the outside. Before Calder could say anything, Mr. Watch pointed toward a massive pile of children's picture books. "Need to be shelved." He turned back toward the bag and added P.E. "But I'd like to deliver that," Calder blurted. "I mean, she's nice," he added lamely. Nice? He thought to himself, hardly. Mr. Watch stood up and adjusted his suspenders. "I can drop them off myself after work." Calder looked miserably at the picture books. When Mr. Watch went to use the bathroom, Calder rushed over to the bag and peeked inside. They didn't look like the kind of books most people would bother with. There were several on the history of mathematics, a book called On the Plurality of Worlds. On the Plurality of Worlds. and another called The Roots of Coincidence. Calder heard the toilet flush and hurriedly closed the top of the bag. Funny that Mrs. Sharp was also thinking about coincidences. He worked extra quickly on shelving the picture books and returned to the front desk. Mr. Watch was surprised and gave him a smile that relieved a row of small, pointed teeth. No wonder the man usually kept his mouth closed. Need that delivery now? Calder asked. Mr. Watch shrugged. Fine, he said, then reached into his pocket as if to get something. Wait, no, never mind. Go ahead. Calder hurried south on Harper Avenue. Should he stop at Petra's and let her know where he was going just in case something happened? No, that was ridiculous. When the door opened, Calder was surprised to see Mrs. Sharp looking almost friendly. The wrinkles in her face were arranged into something that resembled a smile. Come in while I get a check for you, boy. Calder was left to look around again for several moments. This woman had money, no doubt about it. What did she do all day? Calder noticed a hefty pile of papers next to her computer. They were too big to sit on her desk and had their own fold-out table. Maybe she was a writer and a thief? So we have an image here on page 136. Looks like Miss Sharp opening the door. And she looks very hoity-toity, right? She's very proper. But there's probably not a frog or pentomino on this page because it's the every other. When Miss Sharp returned, Calder shifted his weight from one foot to the other, hoping she'd get the hint. She paused to look at his feet as if there was something wrong with him. Calder took the plunge. Miss Sharp, would it be possible for me to use your bathroom? I'm not feeling well. Miss Sharp waved a bony hand behind herself. Up the stairs, turn left. And then she gave Calder a hawk-like glance, as if to say, I'm old, but not that old. Calder, sweating already, scurried up the stairs. They creaked horribly under his boots. Once at the top, he paused, trying to take in as much as possible. Sure enough, to his right, he saw a large standing wardrobe, a perfect storing place. It almost looked identical to the one behind the geographer in Vermeer's painting. Mrs. Sharp's voice came from downstairs. The switch is high, inside the door. Got it, Calder called back, fumbling on the wall inside the first room he came to. The light went on in a huge bathroom. There was another wardrobe with carved panels, this one covering most of the far wall. Oops, Calder called down, trying to sound lost. He was back out in the hall, the bedroom light off. Ah, the bathroom. Calder shut the door, flushed hurriedly, and took several deep breaths. On his way down the stairs, he noticed a built-in cabinet with heavy doors beneath an old bench on the landing. The house was nothing but wooden storage places. Thanks, Miss Sharp, Calder said, realizing he probably didn't have to overdo it on not looking well. He stuffed the check in his pocket. See you soon. The front door was closed almost before he was out of it. The old woman clearly wasn't big on goodbyes. Calder went directly to Petra's and invited her back to his house. It was quieter there, and they had to get his discoveries written down. Petra carried the Vermeer notebook. On the way over, she said happily, My dad just got home. He was doing some kind of research for his department. Strange, it had to be secret, isn't it? Not so strange, Calder mumbled. Secrets seem almost normal these days. Together they sat on the floor in Calder's room. First, Petra wrote down the titles of the books Calder remembered from Mrs. Sharp's bag, and then Calder sketched the standing wardrobes. They each ate several blue ones before there was a knock at the door. Calder, a letter for you. His dad gave them a quick smile. Looks like another one from Tommy. Calder tore it open and began decoding as Petra watched, fascinated. How did you learn to do that? She asked. I made it up, he said, glad she'd happened to see. And then he began to understand what he was reading. It said, so I actually went ahead and decoded this to share with you, save you a little bit of time. So it says, oh, hold on. It says, Calder, Fred moved out. We want to come home, but no money. Tommy. So I'll read it again. It says, Calder, Fred moved out. We want to come home, but no money. Okay, so hopefully I had to like minimize things. All right. Whoa, Petra, there's something else we've got to do. We've got to rescue Tommy. Calder and Petra spent most of the weekend baking brownies and selling them on Harper Avenue. They explained to the neighbors that they were raising money for Tommy Segovia and his mom Zelda to come home because Tommy's new stepfather had deserted his family in New York. There one day, gone the next, was Calder's way of putting it. Everyone was sympathetic and everyone bought. Late Sunday afternoon, as the grand total of $129 was being stuffed into several coffee cans to go to the bank, there was news about the theft. The news was local. According to the evening broadcast, an elderly woman in Chicago had just notified the authorities about receiving a strange delivery. That delivery was a letter that arrived back in October, and that woman was Louise Coffin Sharp. She was asking for police protection. What? Shouted Petra and Calder together. They dropped the jar of quarters they'd been counting and rushed around the corner to where Calder's parents were watching TV in the next room. The broadcaster read the letter aloud. Petra and Calder stared at each other. It sounded exactly like the letter Miss Hussey had described to her class. The broadcaster explained that for an older woman living on her own, it had required an act of great courage to finally take the letter to police. The broadcaster clearly had never met Mrs. Sharp. Oh my God, the letter was delivered right down the block? Calder's mom clapped her hand on her forehead. And Calder, you were just over there. Mrs. Sharp is involved, Calder said to Petra in a low voice. Do you think she was waiting all that time for the thief to get back in touch with her? Who can tell? And think of Miss Hussey's letter. This can't be pure coincidence, Petra said. It's too close. Do you remember that Louise Sharp's husband was a Vermeer scholar? Calder's dad said to his mom. So we learned about the word scholar, right? So that means that Mrs. Sharp's husband heavily studied Vermeer, probably went to school about it. What? Calder and Petra asked in one voice. Calder's dad said he remembered hearing that Mrs. Sharp's husband had been murdered in Europe many years ago, and at the time he had been doing research on Vermeer at the time of his death. I'll read that again. I think I messed it up. Calder's dad said he remembered hearing that Mrs. Sharp's husband had been murdered in Europe many decades ago, and that he had been doing research on Vermeer at the time of his death. Calder and Petra stared at each other. Murdered? How, Dad? Calder asked. I don't remember, but I think it was considered a random street crime, a horrible case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. They never arrested anyone. Poor Mrs. Sharp, Petra said. Well, that could explain some of her odd behavior, and maybe more, Calder added. The phone rang nonstop all over Hyde Park that night. Looking out his living room window after Petra went home, Calder could see the blue flash of police cars and knew they must be stationed outside Mrs. Sharp's house. She'd be safe, no question about that. And nagging doubt crept into Calder's mind. Could Mrs. Sharp be so clever that she had framed herself? He wouldn't put it past her. Even though her husband had been killed, it was hard to picture her being afraid so many years later. And Miss Hussey. What was going on with her? The pieces just didn't fit. Petra, 3 houses away, followed the flashing lights on her ceiling, her thoughts falling into rhythm with the pulse of blue. What about the letters she had picked up that day on Harper Avenue? Had that been one of the original 3? Was Mrs. Sharp really a victim now? Was Miss Hussey? Petra's thoughts swirled in circles, refusing to make sense. Chapter 15. Murder in Hot Chocolate. The university school was buzzing the next day. Miss Hussey was not there, and word had leaked to the papers that she had been arrested the night before as a suspect in the theft. Her class was out of control. It took the substitute half the morning to stop the accusations and shouting. A suspect? She'd never help a criminal. How do you know? Maybe she was forced into it. Remember when her arm was hurt? She would have called the police right away. I know her. We all know her, dummy. What we don't know is what's going on. Somebody in this room must have called the police last night. No way! That rat is dead meat. Yeah, a memory. Even when they'd finally quieted down, the sixth graders glowered at one another suspiciously. There was clearly a traitor in their midst. The substitute handed out sheets of word problems to keep everyone busy. At lunchtime, Petra and Calder sat next to each other as usual. I'm worried that the letter I picked up in your garden was Miss Hussey's from the thief. If it was, then she wouldn't have any proof that she'd been one of the three. And who would believe me if I said I'd found it and lost it again? Petra was pushing her grilled cheese back and forth across her plate. Before Calder could reply, Denise leaned over. Something the rest of us don't know about, Petra? Something you'd like to tell the police? No more secrets now, and hanging out in Calder's garden, really? Petra moved away angrily, bumping Denise's elbow by mistake as she picked up her lunch tray. Denise lost control of her butterscotch pudding, and it slithered down her leg. Slipping on the pudding, she lost her balance and landed heavily on the substitute teacher who was sitting nearby. Petra smiled. Other tables began to giggle, and Denise told the substitute that Petra had pushed her. Calder and a number of kids turned on Denise, and soon they were shouting. Denise turned crimson and yelled, I hate all of you! The class had to stay inside during recess as punishment for bad behavior. It was a horrible day. Hyde Park continued to make the papers. The Chicago Tribune had pictures of both Miss Sharp and Miss Hussey on the front page the next day, as well as the happy news that Miss Hussey had received the same letter as Miss Sharp. Miss Hussey was released. She made a statement about having been terrified, as was Mrs. Sharp, to do anything about the letter. Both women were given round-the-clock police protection. There were many questions. Why would a professional thief ask an old woman and a young school teacher to help him or her? Why hadn't the first letter been followed by another? And who had gotten the third? Then a report added to what Petra and Calder already knew. Louise Sharp was the widow of Leland Sharp, a Vermeer expert who had died in Amsterdam 31 years ago. He had written to his wife that he had made a breakthrough discovery about Vermeer's work and then was silenced before he could share it. The possibility of his death being connected to a discovery about Vermeer changed everything. Mrs. Sharp could be genuinely afraid. Petra and Calder admitted to each other that she just might be innocent, or at least partially innocent. Things with Mrs. Sharp were never simple. Miss Hussey! When she returned the next day, her sixth grade class crowded around, giving her hugs and stepping on her sneakers. How was jail? Were you really scared? How come you didn't tell us that was your letter? We were so worried about you. The questions poured out, but she wouldn't talk about either the arrest or the letter. She looked happy to be back, but nervous. Every time someone dropped a book or bumped into a desk, she jumped. She glanced into the hallway a number of times, as if afraid that the policeman on duty might have left. She took down all of the Vermeer posters and all the newspaper clippings. The classroom looked bare and dismal. She asked the class what they wanted to study, but when they suggested ideas, she didn't seem to be listening. Petra thought about bringing up Charles Fort's research, but could tell it wasn't the right moment. The day after Miss Hussey came back, Petra left science class and went to her homeroom to get a book she'd forgotten. She found Miss Hussey standing alone, her back to the door, talking on a cell phone. Petra took 2 steps into the room and froze. She overheard, "Mistake. But why? It is here. But I can't do that." And then her teacher began to weep. Not wanting her to know that she'd heard, Petra crept out. Petra felt suddenly outraged for Miss Hussey. She was a wonderful person. Who or what was hurting her? And were Mrs. Sharp and Miss Hussey really so protected now? Petra didn't think so. Something was very wrong with Miss Hussey. "Come on, Calder," Petra said when school ended. "Let's go someplace we don't usually go, someplace on campus. How about Fargo Hall? I've got money for hot chocolate." So just to remind you, in your book, you have a map of the town right here. It's not really a page. It's like at the very beginning of the book. Like there's acknowledgments. There's this quote from Charles Fort, the table of contents, and then there is the map. So you can find Fargo Hall. That's number 1. And it is, did you guys find it? There's Cotter's house, there's Petra's house, there's Miss Sharp's house. Okay, guys. Oh, 1. It's the big building in the corner. All right. So Fargo Hall. I've got money for hot chocolate. Petra's hat was pulled down almost to her eyebrows, and her hair fanned out in a black halo around the bottom. She was walking a couple of steps ahead of Calder. You remember what Mrs. Sharp said about people not looking carefully enough at what's around them? Of course, Calder said. I think we should be careful, that's all. What's the matter? Something happened? Calder was looking curiously at her. I'll tell you when we get there. They plodded quietly through the dim afternoon light, heading 2 blocks north on University Avenue. Fargo Hall, close to a century old, so 100 years old, had stone gargoyles and carved human heads on every turret and ledge. A tangle of leafless ivy clutched at the limestone walls. All right, so we have an image on page 150, and I think I'm getting faster at this because I just saw a frog. I looked up at where the gargoyles are supposed to be, and that's where I saw 1 frog. But so there has to be either more frogs or some pentominoes. Okay, I found a pentomino. Did you see it in the stained glass window? There could be more though. I'm going to make a note of this one. Page 150. At least 1 frog. And that pentomino is a Z? I think it's a Z. I think. All right, I'm going to go back and look at that later though. So you don't have to wait for me if I'm slower than you. As they pulled open the heavy doors on 57th Street, there was a comforting blast of heat and sudden messiness. Petra bought 2 hot chocolates with whipped cream, and they headed through the French doors into what looked like a giant living room. There was a fire in the fireplace, and students were scattered around in armchairs, talking quietly or reading. They sat down on huge leather chairs in a corner. Here's what I'm thinking, Petra began. You and I know some things other people don't. There are all the coincidences that have led us along, the possible storage places in Mrs. Sharp's house, and my feeling that the painting might be hidden behind dark wood. Right, Calder nodded toward the walls in the room they were sitting in. It's everywhere. I think we need to go into higher gear and start actively hunting, Petra told Calder about overhearing Miss Hussey's conversation. I have a feeling that she may be in real danger. We may not have much time. Calder put down his cup and started running his fingers excitedly through his pentominoes. Shh, Petra said, aware of someone glaring at them. Someone in a dark armchair across the room. Calder pulled out one of the pieces. It's the U. U for understand? No, that's not right. It's U for under. Under. Maybe the painting is hidden beneath something. What else do we have to go on? Petra asked. Well, what have you heard today? It is here, Petra repeated Miss Hussey's words. Here? Said Calder. Imagine that Miss Hussey, being adventuresome and wanting to do the right thing for art, did help the thief. Or how about this? Imagine that she and Mrs. Sharp are working together. They do know each other. Imagine Miss Hussey hid the painting and Mrs. Sharp knows where it is. Imagine they picked the spot they both knew. What would be a logical place? Maybe it's also U for university school. What a brilliant place to hide something around 100 kids. Calder was jabbing the U pentomino into the arm of his chair for emphasis. Great. And imagine that we found the painting and no one ever had to know that Miss Hussey was involved, except you and me, and we'd never tell. We'd be rescuing all 3 of them, the lady, Miss Hussey, and Mrs. Sharp. How about the third person, the person who got letter number 3? Petra glanced over to see that the armchair in the corner was empty. The dark horse, the difficult piece in any puzzle that doesn't seem to be there at all until you need it. Calder popped the U back into his pocket. Both tried not to get too excited. Charles Fort, as Calder reminded Petra on the way home, collected 294 showers of living things without knowing why. And that is the end of chapter 15. Bye, everyone.